History remembers Ronald Reagan as the 40th President of the United States, the great communicator who reshaped American politics. But behind the speeches, the policies, and the power was a family trying to live in his shadow. 5 children, born into fame, burdened with expectation, and often at odds with the world their father shaped. What became of them? Here's the truth about Ronald Reagan's 5 children. Number 5. Maureen Elizabeth Reagan. Maureen Elizabeth Reagan was born on January 4, 1941, in Los Angeles, California, the first child of Ronald Reagan and actress Jane Wyman. Her arrival should have marked a joyful beginning, but the family would soon know sorrow. In 1947, Ronald and Jane's second child, Christine, was born prematurely and lived only a single day. The loss left a wound that never fully healed and cast a shadow over the marriage. 2 years later, in 1949, Maureen's parents divorced, an unusual and painful event in that era, especially for a child. For Maureen, the separation meant a divided childhood. Her father remarried in 1952, beginning a new life with Nancy Davis, while Maureen remained close to her mother. She grew up balancing the bonds of a blended family, with her adopted brother Michael, and later her half-siblings Patty Davis and Ron Reagan from her father's second marriage. Her upbringing was a mixture of California sunshine and East Coast formality. She graduated in 1958 from Marymount Secondary School in Tarrytown, New York, a Catholic girls' school where she was known for her confidence and poise. She briefly attended Marymount University in Virginia before leaving to begin her own career. Her first job was at Walker & Dunlop, a mortgage banking firm in Washington, D.C., but she also tested the waters of pageantry, competing in the Miss Washington Beauty Contest in 1959. Like both of her parents, Maureen was drawn to the entertainment world. In the 1960s and 1970s, she appeared in a handful of films and television programs, carving out modest roles that reflected her determination to make her own way. One of her most notable appearances was in Kissin' Cousins, 1964, a musical comedy starring Elvis Presley at the peak of his fame. Later, she popped up on television, including a memorable 1978 Halloween episode of The Love Boat, where she acted opposite Vincent Price's flamboyant, amazing Alonzo. Maureen never reached the star status of her mother or father, but she carried herself with independence, using the stage and screen not as a path to fame, but as a way to step out from under the long shadow of her parents' careers. Her Hollywood years became one chapter in a life that would ultimately be defined less by acting than by politics, advocacy, and resilience. In time, Maureen Reagan shifted her focus from acting to politics, where she blended her father's famous name with her own convictions. She broke new ground by becoming the first child of a U.S. president elected co-chair of the Republican National Committee, a role that gave her real influence in shaping party strategy. Unlike many presidential children who were confined to ceremonial appearances, Maureen stepped fully into the political arena. She even sought office herself. In 1982, she ran for the U.S. Senate in California, though she lost to Pete Wilson. A decade later, she tried again, this time for California's 36th congressional district, but was defeated once more. Though victory eluded her, Maureen earned respect for her persistence and her willingness to fight for her own place in politics, rather than serve merely as an extension of her father's legacy. Her views also showed an independence that set her apart. Though raised Catholic after her mother's conversion, she declared herself pro-choice on abortion, a position at odds with Republican orthodoxy and with her father's presidency. She also criticized the Iran-Contra affair, insisting that Oliver North should have faced a court-martial rather than being celebrated as a hero. These stances made her a rare figure in her party, outspoken, principled, and unwilling to toe the line. Yet her disagreements with Ronald Reagan never severed their bond. Their relationship, though marked by debate, remained one of affection and mutual respect. Maureen's most meaningful public service came after her father's diagnosis. When Ronald Reagan revealed in 1994 that he was living with Alzheimer's disease, she became a tireless advocate for awareness and research. She joined the board of the Alzheimer's Association, where her candor and compassion helped break down the stigma surrounding the illness. She spoke openly about the toll it took on families, urging others not to hide their struggles, but to confront them with honesty and courage. In the late 1990s, Maureen faced a health crisis of her own. She was diagnosed with melanoma, an aggressive form of skin cancer. Even as she underwent treatments, she continued to speak publicly, raising awareness with the same determination she brought to politics. In 2001, her story took a poignant turn when she was hospitalized at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. At the very same time, her father was being treated there after a serious fall. Father and daughter, once bound by public life, now shared the quiet intimacy of illness, only a few floors apart. Maureen Reagan's long battle with melanoma ended on August 8, 2001, in Granite Bay, California. She was 60 years old. She was laid to rest at Calvary Catholic Cemetery and Mausoleum in Sacramento, a quiet close to a life spent in the public eye, yet defined by her own independence. Her funeral was held on August 19, 2001, at the Cathedral of the Blessed Sacrament in Sacramento. Friends, family, and colleagues gathered to remember her courage and her candor. Among them was actor David Hyde Pierce, star of Frasier, with whom Maureen had volunteered at the Alzheimer's Association. Pierce recalled her fierce spirit, even in illness. When she was given lemons, he told mourners, she did not make lemonade. She took the lemons, threw them back, and said, "Oh, no, you don't." It was a fitting tribute to a woman who had spent her life refusing to play the expected role. Maureen Reagan was the daughter of a president, an actress, a political figure, and an advocate. But above all, she was her own person, outspoken, resilient, and unwilling to be defined by anyone else's script. Number 4. Michael Edward Reagan. Michael Edward Reagan's story began far from politics or the Hollywood spotlight. He was born John Charles Flaucher on March 18, 1945, in Los Angeles, to Essie Irene Flaucher, an unmarried woman from Kentucky. His biological father, John Burgholzer, was a U.S. Army corporal. Soon after his birth, the infant was adopted by actor Ronald Reagan and his first wife, actress Jane Wyman. They gave him a new name and a place in one of America's most famous families. Michael's school years were rocky. He was briefly enrolled at Loyola High School before being expelled, and later finished at the Judson School, a boarding school in Arizona, in 1964. He tried college, first at Arizona State and then at Los Angeles Valley College, but never graduated. His youth wasn't without controversy. In 1965, the FBI quietly informed Ronald Reagan, then rising in politics, that Michael had been seen associating with the son of mob boss Joseph Bonanno. The matter was kept discreet, and the connection ended quickly, but it was a brush with scandal that could have haunted his father's career. Finding his footing took time. Michael worked ordinary jobs far from the glamour of Hollywood or politics. He sold clothes for Hart, Schaffner, and Marx, handled catering events for a Los Angeles food service company, and later moved into sales at Industrial Circuits, a circuit board firm owned by businessman Robert Herring Sr. These roles were steady, if unremarkable. Michael was carving out a living on his own terms. By the mid-1980s, though, he began edging closer to the entertainment world that had shaped his parents' lives. He took small roles in television and film, including an appearance on Falcon Crest, the popular primetime soap starring his mother, Jane Wyman. In 1987, he landed in front of the camera in a bigger way, as the host of the first season of the TV game show Lingo. Michael Reagan eventually found his biggest platform not in television, but behind a microphone. His break came in Southern California, where he began filling in on KABC in Los Angeles for veteran radio host Michael Jackson. That opportunity led to his own slot at KSDO in San Diego, and from there, his career in talk radio took off. Through the 1990s and into the 2000s, he became the voice of The Michael Reagan Show, a nationally syndicated conservative talk program that aired on networks like Premiere and Radio America. His show gave him a chance to mix politics with personal reflections, and while he never quite reached the ratings heights of Rush Limbaugh or Sean Hannity, he built a loyal following. In later years, Reagan stepped away from the daily grind of radio, focusing more on public speaking engagements, especially those centered on his father's legacy. He also turned to writing. In 1988, with journalist Joe Hyams, he published Michael Reagan. On the Outside Looking In, an autobiography that revealed the challenges of growing up as the adopted son of Ronald Reagan and Jane Wyman. In it, he also disclosed painful memories of being sexually abused at age 7 by a camp counselor, a story he said shaped much of his adult struggles. Later, in 2005, he wrote Twice Adopted, where he reflected on rejection, family fractures, and ultimately his embrace of born-again Christianity. As a political commentator, Reagan never shied from controversy. In 2013, he made headlines for a syndicated column in which he argued that legalizing same-sex marriage would lead to what he called a slippery slope toward polygamy, bestiality, and even murder. The remarks drew sharp criticism, but reflected his hardline views on cultural issues. Michael Reagan has never been afraid of controversy, and over the years his outspoken style has sparked more than a few headlines. In 2008, when activist Mark Dice urged people to send conspiracy DVDs to U.S. soldiers in Iraq, claiming the 9/11 attacks were an inside job, Reagan fired back on his radio show, saying Dice should be executed for treason. Media watchdog groups blasted the remark, demanding to know whether his network condoned such language on the air. He has continued to voice strong opinions on national security. In 2014, he wrote a piece called Profile or Die, arguing that profiling was necessary to prevent terrorist attacks and warning that ordinary citizens might be left to defend themselves. His relationship with Donald Trump has been complicated. During the 2016 Republican primaries, Reagan publicly opposed Trump and endorsed Ted Cruz instead. But in the years that followed, he shifted, saying on social media that he had voted for Trump in both the 2020 and 2024 elections. In 2025, he defended Trump's tariffs, calling them a necessary tool in trade policy. Reagan's career has also been shadowed by legal troubles. In 1981, Los Angeles prosecutors investigated him for alleged securities violations connected to a gasohol startup he ran out of his home. They suspected he had improperly sold stock and even used investors' money to cover personal expenses. Later that same year, he was cleared of all charges. Decades later, in 2012, Reagan faced another lawsuit from a business partner over Reagan.com, an email venture. 3 years later, a jury found Reagan and his partners liable for conversion and breach of fiduciary duty, ordering each to pay more than $600,000 in damages. Michael Reagan's personal life has seen its share of ups and downs. In 1971, he married Pamela Gail Putnam, the daughter of NFL coach Dwayne Putnam, but the marriage ended in divorce just a year later. A few years later, in 1975, he found more lasting stability when he married Colleen Stearns, an interior decorator. The two wed at the church on the Way in California and went on to raise 2 children, Cameron and Ashley. Today, they live in the Toluca Lake neighborhood of Los Angeles. Life in the Reagan family has always come with public scrutiny, and Michael has not shied away from speaking his mind, even about family matters. In 2011, he openly criticized his adoptive brother, Ron Reagan, calling him an embarrassment after Ron speculated in his memoir that their father, President Ronald Reagan, may have shown signs of Alzheimer's while still in office. Number 3. Christine Reagan. Christine Reagan was born in 1947, the second daughter of actor Ronald Reagan and Academy Award-winning actress Jane Wyman. She came into the world during what should have been a hopeful moment in her parents' marriage. Ronald was building his career in Hollywood, and Jane had already achieved major success on screen. They had welcomed their first daughter, Maureen, in 1941, and together they seemed to be shaping a growing family. But happiness quickly turned to heartbreak. Christine was born prematurely and died the same day she was delivered. She never left the hospital, and she never went home. For Ronald and Jane, the loss was devastating. Jane, who had been deeply invested in the pregnancy, was crushed. Ronald, who had always craved family stability after his own difficult childhood, retreated into silence. The loss of Christine left a wound that neither of them could heal. Many biographers believe Christine's death was a turning point in their marriage. Tension that had been growing between Ronald and Jane deepened into distance. They tried to carry on, adopting a son, Michael Reagan, later that same year. But the grief lingered in the background, unresolved and unspoken. By 1949, the marriage ended in divorce, leaving Maureen and Michael in a divided home and Ronald on a path that would eventually lead him toward politics and a new marriage with Nancy Davis. For Maureen, Christine was the sister she never had the chance to know. The silence surrounding Christine's brief life left Maureen with her own questions about loss and memory. For Michael, adopted after Christine's death, there was always the quiet awareness that his place in the family came in the shadow of tragedy. Christine's name is rarely mentioned in accounts of Ronald Reagan's life, but her absence shaped him. Friends noted that he rarely spoke about her, yet he carried an air of melancholy when recalling that period of his first marriage. In a family that later became one of America's most public, Christine remained the hidden chapter, the baby who never grew up, whose presence was felt only in the grief she left behind. Number 2. Patty Davis. Patricia Ann Reagan was born on October 21, 1952, at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles, the only daughter of Ronald and Nancy Reagan. Known within the family as Patty, she grew up as the older sister of Ron Reagan, the younger adoptive sister of Michael Reagan, and the half-sister of Maureen Reagan. Her childhood was spent in the privileged yet demanding atmosphere of Bel Air. She attended the John Thomas Dye School and later graduated from the Orm School of Arizona in 1970. But behind the image of a political family's daughter, Patty carried private struggles. In a candid New York Times op-ed years later, she admitted to an addiction to prescription amphetamines that began in her teens and stretched into her early 20s. Cocaine use, reckless driving, and self-destructive choices marked those years, a turbulence that shaped her search for independence. Patty pursued higher education with creative ambition. She studied drama and creative writing at Northwestern University, then transferred to the University of Southern California for 2 more years. Determined to make her own career apart from her famous last name, she adopted her mother's maiden name, Davis, as her professional identity. By the late 1970s, Patty Davis had become politically outspoken. She was active in the anti-nuclear movement and continued her activism even after her father entered the White House in 1981. Her opposition to his policies, often voiced publicly, stirred controversy and created visible tension within the Reagan family. Unlike many presidential children who aligned themselves quietly with their parents' image, Patty defined herself in opposition. She never affiliated with the Republican Party and instead became one of its sharpest critics, carving out her own voice and her own path. In the early 1980s, Patty Davis stepped briefly into acting, appearing in a handful of television shows. But her real passion was writing. In 1986, she published her first novel, Home Front. Loosely inspired by her own experiences, the book blurred the line between fiction and autobiography. That honesty, however, came at a cost. The novel sparked controversy and criticism, with many seeing thinly veiled portrayals of her famous family. Her second novel, Deadfall, followed soon after. It was her 1992 memoir, The Way I See It, that made headlines. In it, she revealed private family tensions and White House dramas with striking candor. Later, Patty admitted she regretted the form her revelations took, though not the substance of her critique. The book cemented her reputation as the rebellious Reagan child, unafraid to break silences, even at the expense of family peace. Davis's independence also extended into modeling. In July 1994, she appeared on the cover of Playboy and posed in a full-frontal pictorial inside. The issue became one of the magazine's most controversial covers, sparking fierce debate about propriety, feminism, and family legacy. A companion VHS tape was even released. Years later, Patty posed again for magazines such as More, proving her comfort with choices that shocked traditionalists. Over time, however, her public voice shifted. When Ronald Reagan was diagnosed with Alzheimer's in the 1990s, Patty began a new chapter. She poured her feelings into The Long Goodbye, 2004, a memoir that reflected tenderness, regret, and reconciliation. Alongside it, she wrote essays and features for the New York Times, Newsweek, and Time, balancing her identity as both critic and daughter. Her writing also moved into screenplays. In 2007, her script Spring Thaw was adapted into the Hallmark Channel movie Sacrifices of the Heart, starring Melissa Gilbert and Ken Howard. Patty Davis had built a career defined not by her father's politics, but by her own voice. Sometimes raw, sometimes controversial, but always candid. Her love life remained a matter of public curiosity. In the 1980s, she dated actor Timothy Hutton and later spent 2 years with Peter Strauss. In later years, Patty admitted her frustration with the Secret Service's constant surveillance during her father's presidency, saying their strict time limits and monitoring made normal relationships nearly impossible. That pressure, she confessed, was part of why she rushed into marriage with Paul Grilly, a yoga instructor and one of the founders of Yin Yoga. They married in 1984 but divorced in 1990, childless. Patty never remarried. Outside of family and relationships, she carved out her own convictions. She became a vegetarian, voiced opposition to marijuana prohibition, and in 2011 launched Beyond Alzheimer's at UCLA, a program she continues to run, dedicated to helping families cope with the disease that claimed her father. Patty also remained outspoken in public life, often unafraid to challenge powerful figures, including her own father's memory. In September 2018, she published a Washington Post op-ed revealing she had been sexually assaulted nearly 40 years earlier by a Hollywood studio executive. She released the piece in solidarity with Christine Blasey Ford, whose testimony during Brett Kavanaugh's Supreme Court confirmation hearings had been criticized by skeptics. Patty wrote that she, too, struggled with blurred details of the assault, but insisted such memory gaps do not erase the trauma. That same year, after the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting, she criticized President Donald Trump's failure to console the nation, writing bluntly, "Let's stop asking him." In August 2019, when newly released Nixon tapes revealed Ronald Reagan making racist remarks in a 1971 phone call, Patty again wrote in the Washington Post saying, "There is no defense, no rationalization, no suitable explanation for what my father said." Her voice has remained steady against violence and hate. In October 2021, she condemned the full release of John Hinckley Jr., who attempted to assassinate her father in 1981. And in 2024, after the attempted assassination of Donald Trump, she spoke out again, denouncing political violence of any kind and recalling the emotional toll her own family endured after her father was shot. Through it all, Patty Davis has remained what she always was: independent, outspoken, and unwilling to soften her truth for anyone. Her life has often been complicated, at times painful, but it has been lived on her own terms, apart from the expectations of her famous name. Number 1. Ron Reagan. Ronald Prescott Reagan was born on May 20, 1958, at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles, the only child of Ronald Reagan and his second wife, Nancy Davis Reagan. He grew up in Sacramento while his father served as California's governor, surrounded by the busy world of politics, but often moving in a different orbit from his famous family. His sister, Patty Davis, was 5 years older, while his adoptive brother Michael and half-sister Maureen belonged to his father's first marriage. Another half-sister, Christine, had died as an infant years before his birth. From an early age, Ron showed an independent streak. At 12, he told his parents he was done with church. He considered himself an atheist, a declaration that set him apart in a household shaped by conservative values and his father's public faith. School life was equally unconventional. He attended the Webb School of California but was eventually expelled. As he later recalled with a wry smile, the official reason was that he had gone to a school dance in a classmate's car, an infraction the administration was waiting to pounce on. Ron tried college but found little inspiration there. He left Yale after just one semester, choosing instead to follow his passion, ballet. Against every expectation of a political family scion, he joined the Joffrey II Dancers, the apprentice company of the Joffrey Ballet, where he trained under Sally Braley. For Ron, ballet wasn't rebellion. It was joy, movement, and freedom. By 1980, his talent had earned him real recognition, though his parents rarely attended his performances. A Time profile at the time noted the odd distance. Here was a gifted dancer in a world far removed from politics, and yet his parents, by then famous in their own right, had barely seen him perform. When Ronald and Nancy finally came to watch him dance in 1981, just months after the elder Reagan entered the White House, the president wrote in his diary that Ron's performance was darn good and reminded him of Fred Astaire. By the time his father was president, Ron was already forging his own path. He was 22, married, and living independently, and he never moved into the White House. 18 months into his father's presidency, he even gave up Secret Service protection, preferring privacy and freedom over the constant shadow of guards. In February 1986, Ron Reagan stepped briefly into pop culture when he hosted an episode of Saturday Night Live. By then, he had already carved out a reputation as the most unconventional of Ronald Reagan's children. The ballet dancer, the outspoken atheist, the son who never fit the mold of a political dynasty. After his father left the White House in 1989, Ron became more politically active. Unlike his father, his views leaned openly liberal. For years, he had kept quiet, not wanting his opinions to be used as fodder against his dad. "The press never cared about my opinions as such, only as they related to him," he explained later. But once the Reagan presidency ended, he began to speak in his own voice. In 1991, he launched The Ron Reagan Show, a late-night talk show that took on politics and culture. It was short-lived, overshadowed by giants like The Tonight Show and Nightline, but it was an early glimpse of his willingness to push into political commentary. He went on to write for magazines, co-host programs on cable, and even had a stint on the BBC's Record Breakers, sending weekly reports from America to British audiences. Ron also became active behind the scenes. He served on the board of the Creative Coalition, alongside actors like Susan Sarandon and Christopher Reeve, advocating for the arts, public education, and First Amendment rights. In 2005, he co-hosted Connected, Coast to Coast, with Monica Crowley on MSNBC, a left-right pairing that highlighted his willingness to spar with opposing views. Later, from 2008 until 2010, he hosted The Ron Reagan Show on Air America Radio, bringing his progressive stance to the microphone every weekday. In 2011, Ron published My Father at 100, a memoir. The book reflected warmly on his father, but also raised controversy. In it, Ron recalled noticing small mental lapses during Reagan's presidency, details that, in hindsight, made him wonder whether the early signs of Alzheimer's had already appeared while his father was still in office. His remarks drew sharp criticism, including from his brother Michael, though Ron later clarified that he was not claiming dementia, only subtle signs that seemed clearer with time. Ron Reagan never joined a political party, but he has long leaned Democratic. In July 2004, just weeks after his father's death from Alzheimer's disease, he stepped onto the stage at the Democratic National Convention. Calm, direct, and unafraid to break with the Republican legacy his family represented, Ron argued passionately for lifting President George W. Bush's restrictions on federal funding for embryonic stem cell research. He believed research could lead to or even a cure for the disease that had father. We between the future and the past, between reason and ignorance, true compassion and mere ideology. He thunderous applause. Nancy Reagan, who often out of politics, quietly supported his stand. That same year, Ron sharpened his criticism of the Bush administration, accused it of lying to gain power, warning that it showed no respect for the his father's reputation for its own ends. He expanded those blistering essay for titled The Case Against George W. Bush. In the 2004 election, he voted for John Kerry, making clear that he saw his father's conservatism as a very different philosophy from the direction Republicans had taken under Bush. Over the next decade, Ron became a consistent voice for progressive politics. He endorsed Barack Obama in 2008, Bernie Sanders in 2016, and often used his platform on television and in print to speak bluntly about the changes he saw in American politics. By 2020, with Donald Trump in the White House, he didn't hold back. He called the Republican Party an entirely illegitimate political party and described Trump as a disgrace to the office of the presidency. He went further, saying his father, so often invoked by modern conservatives, would have been ashamed to see what the GOP had become. Ron's words cut sharply because of who he is. The son of Ronald Reagan, standing outside his father's shadow, refusing to let his name be used in ways that betrayed the values he believed his father once held. For decades, he has been the family's most outspoken dissenter, never afraid to risk disapproval in order to say what he believes. Ron Reagan built a life far from Washington's spotlight. He settled in Seattle, where he carved out his own path with his wife, clinical psychologist Doria Palmieri. They were married in 1980 and shared more than 3 decades together before she passed away in 2014 from a neuromuscular disease. Their marriage was close, though they never had children. 4 years later, Ron found love again and remarried, this time to Federica Bassagni in 2018. From an early age, Ron was open about his independence not just in politics, but in belief. In interviews, he described himself as an atheist, though he said he felt drawn to elements of Buddhism, particularly through his wife's practice. His refusal to conform shaped how he saw public life. "I can't be elected to anything," he once told Larry King Live, "because polls all say that people won't elect an atheist." Rather than shy away, he embraced the label. In 2010, Ron was named to the Freedom from Religion Foundation's honorary board. 4 years later, he appeared in a bold television ad, looking directly into the camera and declaring himself an unabashed atheist, not afraid of burning in hell. The spot resurfaced during the 2020 Democratic presidential debates, drawing new attention to his bluntness and his willingness to say aloud what many avoided. For Ron Reagan, that has always been the through line: candor. Whether on politics, faith, or family, he has chosen honesty over expectation. He grew up the son of one of the most powerful men in the world, yet spent his life reminding people he was not his father's echo. In Seattle, far from Hollywood and Washington, Ron Reagan lives as he always has, on his own terms. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this look into history's hidden side, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join me next time for more untold stories.